So thank you very much, Mufti, Professor Gallant, everyone for organizing this wonderful, unique event for the first time. It's really an honor and an excitement to be able to share this platform with all of you. So what is the purpose of human existence? How can we achieve our potential in virtue or in ethics? My name is Aqil Visram. I am a double major in Islamic studies and economics. And today I'm going to be exploring the notions of virtue, pleasure, and the levels of the self in three medieval Muslim thinkers, Miskawayh, Ṭūsī, and the Brethren of Purity. This, I'd like to stress, is one interpretation of Islam from the medieval period and is by no means comprehensive of the tradition. But when we look at Islamic ethical literature, one theme we do see permeating these texts and many others is the idea of a final accountability to God, right? And the questions of how we can live our life in a way that allows us to be in a good position in that context. So these thinkers looked at nature around them and viewed it as a reflection of their own internal dispositions. So they believe that a series of elements or beings having a particular perfection of disposition within itself. And so the three main ones here I'll focus on is the vegetative, the animal, and the rational. This comprises of a continuous hierarchy between species even. And so you see the perfect vegetative kingdom, the date palm tree, showing some characteristics even of the animals. So the date palm tree, for instance, is selective in its mating. The greatest of the animals, whether you take Tusi's position of it being a horse, a trained horse, or a falcon, or you take Miskawayh's idea of it being an ape, is showing some sorts of reflection, rationality, and some ideas that we would think of as almost human. And then the natural disposition, the perfect disposition of the human being rationality or contemplation. And the greatest of the humans then, in a very much religious way as well, being attributed, especially by Tusi, who is a Shi'i writer, to either the prophets or the imams who receive or interpret revelation from God. So I'll take a quick detour and think about what is pleasure in this context, and how do these thinkers define the idea of pleasure. The Brethren of Purity write that bodily pleasure is nothing more than an emergence from pain, while pain itself is a removal from equilibrium towards one of the two extremes, either towards an increase or diminishment. The principle governing all other bodily pains and pleasures is characterized by this pattern. Miskawayh writes, the nature of all pleasures is the same, that they are all experienced by man only after certain pains which affect him, and that every sensual pleasure is a deliverance from pain and suffering. And Tusi, the true sense of bodily pleasures is release from suffering and rest from fatigue. So what we see common in these three definitions then is an idea of pleasure being a rest from pain, a respite from pain. And being in, especially we see in, for example, the Brethren of it being sort of a mean between extremes, right? And that will correspond later to the idea of a virtuous golden mean, right? A virtuous mean between the extremes of excess and deficiency. I should point out, for example, some of you who might be familiar with some Greek texts, many Greek philosophical texts were readily available to these thinkers who were some of them very close to a prominent translation movement in the medieval Islamic world, which translated Greek and other texts into Arabic. So as I mentioned a bit earlier, these thinkers viewed each of the dispositions of natural beings, of the three levels of natural beings that I explained, as a reflection of our own internal dispositions, and also as an allusion to a hierarchy of our own dispositions. So the desires of each of these beings, each of these creatures then, is also reflected within us. You might think of the vegetative desire for food or for drink, right, being reflected within us. The desire of the animal for revenge or for dominance being reflected within us. And of course, our own greatest desire of reflection and contemplation reflected also within us. And each of these selves that is expressed in these authors, that these authors think about, has a virtuous mean associated with it. So again, if we think about the desires for food and drink of the vegetative, we have a vice of deficiency of the self, where we're thinking about, for example, sluggishness of appetite, a vice of excess, where we think about greed, and then a mean of virtue, which would be continence or temperance. Similarly, for the animal, we have the excess of recklessness or foolhardiness, the deficiency of cowardice, and the mean of courage. For the rational self, we have the excess of ingenuity, or you might think of oversmartness, and the deficiency of foolishness with a mean of wisdom. And so then pleasure, the idea of pleasure that we explored, or the Arabic perhaps rest or raha, is the idea of moving towards that virtuous mean and attaining virtue. And then the successful perfection of disposition, that achieving of the greatest character, right, is the idea of being able to keep all of the selves at a mean. So the rational self then allocating an appropriate amount to the animal self, which then allocates to the vegetative self in such a way that all three are at a mean. These thinkers often conceptualize, in some contexts, of the mean being not a center between a line that I explored in the previous slide, but as a mean as a center between a circle. The way I understand that is to refer to the greatest virtue of justice. That's the virtue itself of having that being, say, balanced with achieving a mean on all three selves. And so you might even think of three lines then that go through that virtue, or many more, as all of these have some virtues. Pleasure, again, being returning to that. And so any movement away from the mean, that virtue, would be painful. Any movement back towards it is pleasurable. I'd like to share one of my favorite parts of reading some of these texts was some of the practical advice, so to speak, that these thinkers offer in terms of how to perfect one's character. And so I'd like to offer some of these and share two ideas that they had. The first reflects the idea of needing to know yourself in order to perfect your character. And so these thinkers will build, for example, Miskawayh will build off of the Galen's idea of consulting a friend and asking him about him or her about your vices, so that you can reform your character, so you can perfect your dispositions. And even Galen and Miskawayh both admit that in order to get a friend to tell you what's wrong with you, you usually have to push them a little bit. Not many of our friends, thankfully maybe, are willing to just scold us right off the bat. So you have to push them a little bit to get some information. So Miskawayh takes the situation, he's like, okay, well, is there a better way we can approach this? And for him, he's like, maybe we don't ask a friend, let's ask an enemy. Because I'm sure many of us will experience our enemies are not so hesitant in telling us what's wrong with us. And not only that, the friend will, even after pushing her perhaps very much, they will still end up inflating your virtues and depressing your vices. Whereas an enemy will inflate your vices and compress your virtues, which then results in a situation where you are trying to perfect even things in dispositions where you are already very strong in. And that is an even more further allows you to perfect your character. The second piece of practical advice I'll share actually comes, is reflected in perhaps my favorite parable reading these sources, which is about a cowardly philosopher who seeks to attain the virtue of courage. So here we're talking about the animal self, and he has a deficiency of courage. This philosopher then, in an attempt to gain courage, actually goes out and sets sail in reckless waters. So he takes sail and goes in very, very dangerous conditions. And what this points to is actually the idea of aiming for the other extreme. So in this case, the philosopher has a deficiency of courage. And so he's aiming for the excess. He's aiming for recklessness so that he can attain the virtue in the middle and attain the virtue of courage. So I'll leave you with a poem, actually, from the famous Jalaluddin Rumi's Masnavi. On death, I left being a mineral, then grew, and changed from plant to animal form too. Then died to that, to be a human here. When did death make me less? What should I fear? I'll die to humanness at the next battle, then spread my wings and soar above each angel. I must transcend the angel status too. All perishes except God's face proves true. Sacrificed, I'll die to the angel then, and go beyond the imaginings of men. And then I'll then be non-existent, and I'll hear, to him we are returning, sound so clear. Understood in the context of these thinkers and their philosophy, Rumi is explaining his own journey of the perfection of his own dispositions as he moved from being a mineral or the lower side of the vegetative to a plant, to an animal, to a human, and to even an angel, which these thinkers also talk about as being a status where the humans are free of their bodies. Rumi also, though, in a similar way to many other mystical thinkers, finishes by expressing a desire for the ultimate vision of God. And with that, I will conclude.